In 1939, a young Jewish man named Samuel Levin fled Vienna with his parents, escaping certain death with the help of an unexpected savior, the Philippines. Under the leadership of President Manuel Quezon, thousands of Jewish families were granted refuge, and Samuel carried that gift of life with him for the rest of his days. After the war, he moved to Israel, built a family, and built a future. But he never stopped telling his children and grandchildren that without the Philippines, none of them would be here. In his final journal entry, he left a simple request. If you can, return to the place that once saved this family. Decades later, his grandchildren would set foot on Philippine soil, not in search of rescue, but in search of meaning. What they would discover was not only the kindness of strangers, but also the possibility that this faraway land had been connected to their people long before Samuel's time, in ways written deep into history, faith, and destiny. In the late 1930s, the world was closing in on Jewish families in Europe. Vienna, once a vibrant center of culture, music, and learning, had become a place of fear and shadows. For 19-year-old Samuel Levin, every day was a question of survival. He had seen friends disappear overnight, neighbors forced from their homes, and the streets filled with voices of hate. The world, it seemed, had shut its doors. And then, against all odds, one door opened. It was not in America, nor in Europe, but in a place few in Vienna had ever imagined, the Philippines. Thousands of miles away, under the leadership of President Manuel Quezon, the Philippines became one of the very few nations willing to welcome Jews escaping Nazi persecution. It was a decision rooted not in politics, but in courage and humanity. Samuel, along with his parents, was among those given a precious visa. With trembling hands, he held the papers that meant life. In 1939, as war swept across Europe, the Levin family left everything behind, their home, their language, the only world they had known, and boarded a ship bound for the Pacific. When they arrived in Manila, they stepped into a country that felt impossibly different. The air was heavy with heat in the scent of tropical flowers, the streets alive with voices in languages they could not yet understand. But above all, there was kindness. Neighbors offered food, strangers offered smiles. Samuel often remembered the jeepney drivers who waited patiently for his family to find the right fare, the market vendors who slipped an extra fruit into his mother's basket, and the children who taught him Tagalog words between bursts of laughter. These small gestures, given without expectation, became lifelines for a young man who had lost almost everything. The war would come to the Philippines too, and Samuel's family would once again face fear. But the seed had already been planted, the knowledge that in their darkest hour, a distant land had chosen to stand with them. After the war, Samuel moved to Israel, built a family, and carried with him the memory of Manila. Around his dinner table, he would tell the story again and again. If not for the Philippines, we would not be here today. When Samuel grew old, he wrote a final entry in his journal. It was not long, not grand, but it carried the weight of a lifetime. If you can, let our children and grandchildren return to the place that once saved this family. 86 years after Samuel Levin first stepped onto Philippine soil, his grandchildren found themselves retracing his path, though for very different reasons. They did not come fleeing persecution. They came as students, searching for opportunity, unaware that they were also stepping into their grandfather's story. The first to arrive was Noah Levin, 25 years old, from Tel Aviv. Practical, ambitious, and weighed down by the rising costs of medical school back home, he chose Cebu for its affordable tuition and English language courses. At first, it was purely a financial decision, a matter of numbers on a page. But life in Cebu had a way of reaching past the surface. In the chaos of jeepney rides, in the quiet patience of professors, in the unexpected generosity of classmates who shared meals without hesitation, Noah began to feel something more. Slowly, almost reluctantly, he realized he was living the same kindness his grandfather had described decades earlier. Then came Miriam Cohen, just 21, from Beersheba. She was quiet, almost withdrawn, carrying with her the uncertainty of someone still searching for her place in the world. She enrolled in an environmental studies program in Davao, a city known for its openness and natural beauty. There, something shifted. She was drawn in by the warmth of her peers, who welcomed her not as a foreigner, but as a sister. When a typhoon struck a nearby village, Miriam joined her classmates in relief efforts, delivering food, planting seedlings, and listening to stories of resilience. For the first time, she felt the stirring of a calling greater than herself. She began organizing community projects, her shyness giving way to purpose. The last to arrive was Yonatan Halavi, 24 from Jerusalem. His goal was simple: improve his English. Manila, he thought, would be a temporary stop, just a stepping stone. But a chance invitation changed everything. A friend brought him to a children's center on the edge of the city where volunteers tutored kids in reading and math. What began as a casual visit became a regular commitment. There, surrounded by laughter and tiny hands tugging at his sleeves, Yonatan realized something profound. The Philippines was not only teaching him a language, it was teaching him how to live with an open heart. For each of them, the journey began as an individual pursuit: education, opportunity, language. Yet as weeks turned into months, Noah, Miriam, and Yonatan found themselves bound by something deeper: the quiet echo of their grandfather's voice, reminding them that this land had once been their family's shelter. And now, without planning it, they were beginning to understand his final request. One afternoon in Cebu, Noah sat in the library reviewing medical textbooks when a Filipino professor struck up a conversation. Their talk drifted, as conversations sometimes do, far from medicine. The professor mentioned a lifelong research project that had fascinated him: the search for Ophir, the legendary land described in the Bible as the source of King Solomon's gold, precious woods, and rare treasures. For centuries, scholars had debated its location. Some said Africa. Others pointed to India. But this professor believed the evidence led to the islands of the Philippines. At first, Noah laughed politely. Ophir was a word he had only skimmed in scripture, a vague echo from ancient times. But the professor's passion was contagious. He spoke of trade winds and ancient sea routes, of Hebrew-like words tucked into Philippine languages, of DNA links that hinted at ancient contact. He showed Noah maps that stretched across the Indian Ocean into the Pacific, arrows tracing possible voyages between Israel and these islands thousands of years ago. Noah shared the story with Miriam and Yonatan. They too were skeptical, yet something about the theory lingered in their minds. For Miriam, it was the idea that the land she was serving, the forests, the rivers, the coastlines, could be part of a sacred history connecting her people to this place. For Yonatan, it was the memory of children's voices, their joy so unguarded that it felt like home. And for Noah, it was the unshakable sense that he was walking paths that might have been crossed long before his grandfather, perhaps even in the age of kings. The three of them began reading, questioning, tracing threads that wove history with faith. They knew the theory was not proven and perhaps never could be. Yet it didn't matter. The idea itself carried weight. What if their return to the Philippines was not random? What if Samuel's plea, "Return to the place that once saved our family," was more than a request to honor the past? What if it was also a summons written into the deep currents of destiny? In quiet moments, they confessed their wonder to one another. Maybe, just maybe, they were not the first of their family to step on these shores. Maybe they were walking into an ancient circle, one that stretched from Jerusalem to Manila and back again. For the first time, their grandfather's words felt less like memory and more like prophecy. As their time in the Philippines deepened, Noah, Miriam, and Yonatan felt a growing need to do more than simply study, volunteer, or observe. They wanted to create something lasting, something that could weave their grandfather's gratitude into the life of the communities that had embraced them. Out of late-night conversations and shared meals, an idea began to take shape: a space where Jewish and Filipino culture could meet, learn, and grow together. They called it the Jewish Philippine Community House. The plan was simple but ambitious. It would be a gathering place in Cebu, open to anyone who wished to share in traditions, music, food, and stories. On one side, there would be Hebrew classes for children curious about the language of the Bible. On the other, Filipino songs and dances would be taught to Jewish visitors eager to understand the rhythm of the islands. The house would host Sabbath dinners, where challah bread sat beside trays of adobo, and evenings where Hebrew prayers blended with Tagalog lullabies. Building it was not easy. Funds were scarce, and their own resources limited. Yet something about the vision drew others in. Classmates offered to paint walls. A local carpenter donated wooden benches. Even a jeepney driver who had befriended Noah promised to deliver supplies at no cost. Slowly, the structure came alive, not only from their effort, but from the hands of those who believed in the dream. The day of the opening, the three stood side by side before a small crowd, neighbors, students, friends, and even strangers curious to see what these young foreigners had built. Miriam stepped forward with trembling hands holding a worn notebook, her grandfather's journal. She read aloud a passage he had written in fading ink. "The Filipino people open their doors to us. One day our children and grandchildren will return, not to be saved, but to say thank you." Silence followed. It was not the silence of emptiness, but of hearts holding something too large for words. Then softly at first, someone began to sing. A Hebrew melody, old and familiar, rose into the air. From the other side of the room, a Tagalog song joined it. Voices intertwined, two languages carried by one rhythm. The harmony grew stronger until the walls themselves seemed to tremble with gratitude. For the grandchildren of Samuel Levin, it was no longer just a project. It was the fulfillment of a promise. A seed planted in fear had blossomed, generations later, into a tree of friendship. The weeks after the opening of the community house passed in a blur of shared meals, laughter, and long conversations that stretched late into the night. For Noah, Miriam, and Yonatan, what had begun as separate journeys of study and discovery had become something far more profound. A return that was not about history alone, but about belonging. One evening, the three cousins traveled south to Davao. They found themselves on the shoreline as the sun dipped low, casting the sea in shades of gold and crimson. The waves rolled gently against the sand, and for a long time they stood in silence, each lost in thought. It was Yonatan who finally spoke, his voice soft but steady. "Maybe this is Ophir," he said, gazing at the horizon. "Maybe our ancestors really did stand on these shores thousands of years ago. But for me, what matters more is this. Here we have found a home." The words lingered in the air, carried by the wind. Miriam touched the notebook she carried everywhere now, Samuel's journal, and whispered that she finally understood his final request. It was never about geography alone. It was about gratitude, about planting roots not in fear, but in hope. That night, as the first stars appeared above the palm trees, they lit candles for the Sabbath. The small flames flickered in the tropical breeze, fragile yet unyielding. Around them, Filipino friends gathered, curious and respectful, watching the ritual with quiet wonder. The cousins sang the ancient blessings, their voices weaving together with the hum of the ocean and the laughter of children nearby. In that moment, the Philippines was no longer simply a chapter in their family's past. It was part of their future. They saw in those candles not just the memory of survival, but the birth of something new, a community bound not by tragedy, but by gratitude and love. And yet the story did not close. It remained open, like the sea before them, stretching toward horizons unseen. What would come of this new bond between two peoples? What legacy would they leave for the next generation? No one could say. But as the Sabbath lights glowed softly against the night, one truth was clear. The journey Samuel began in 1939 had not ended. It had only just begun, carried forward in the hearts of his grandchildren and in the friendships they would leave behind on these islands.